China today is at a very, very pivotal point. It has created the wealth. The Kuznets curve is at work. The 11th five-year plan called for 10% reductions in sulfur dioxide, in water, chemical oxygen demand, and 20% in carbon intensity. So there's an awareness. Why is there an awareness? Well, all you have to do is drive in any of the cities, and one can easily see the environment is a critical issue in China today. How critical? 70% of the economy is driven by coal. 27 million tons of SO2 versus the high in the US of 18. 600 tons of mercury. NOx and water quality are all very high. 67% of the cities in China are short of water. 90% of the rivers are polluted. 500,000 kids under the age of 5 die annually because of water quality, and so on and so forth. Something the government is keenly aware of, and I think will be done. I'll give you a short arithmetic, if I can, in the time that I have remaining. If the United States went from 18 to 9 million tons of sulfur and created 123 billion of value, let's use that as a benchmark. China's at 27 billion. So let's assume it cut to 9. If each 9 was worth 123 billion, then if China went from 27 to 9, it would be 250 billion of healthcare cost savings. But there's another rub here. China's geographically the same size as the United States, but a population of, call it 1.3 billion, we'll know after the census, versus 300 million. So the effect should be 4 to 5 times the 250 billion because the population is more concentrated. So just the back of the envelope calculations says that acid rain has got $1 trillion contingent liability in medical costs for China in the next 10 to 20 years if nothing is done with acid rain. That's the magnitude of the problem that we're dealing with. Well, years ago, people would have thought that this would have been an impossible thing to deal with, that it was an untried proposition, that maybe you could do it in sulfur, but you couldn't do it in carbon. That would be something that would not be possible. In fact, not only is sulfur just the beginning, the carbon market in Europe is working and running. And just as an aside note, Christine, you'll appreciate it, the open interest in carbon now is bigger than Brent crude. So carbon is now the largest commodity in Europe. The program is working efficiently, emissions are being reduced, and the targets are being met, but they need to be tightened a bit. In the United States, we didn't have a law. And we started something called the Chicago Climate Exchange. And the Chicago Climate Exchange proposed to be a voluntary program, not mandatory, which companies would sign up. We got a grant to do it in 2000, and from the moment we got the grant to when we opened the exchange, everything, not something, but everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. We got the money. 9/11 occurred, turned the country to terror and not the environment, properly so, followed by the Afghan war, followed by the stock market crashing, the dot-com bubble bursting, Enron imploding and sullying the name of trading, a deep recession, and war in Iraq. That was the background of the beginning of this exchange. Everybody said nobody would join unless there was a law. But the President of the United States at that time said we're not for cap and trade, so the threat of that was even removed. We ran out of $1.2 million in financing. We went to private outside sources. Our first investor, those of you in the capital markets are smile, were the Jesuits, okay? And it was surreal. My secretary, Marilyn, would come in a very hushed way and say, "Richard, it's Father Francis on the phone." And I'd pick it up and say, "Hello, Father, how are you?" And then he'd ask something that you never, ever want a person of the cloth to ask. He would say, "Richard, how's your burn rate?" I'd say, "Father, it's no good." "Richard, are you recruiting any members?" "No, Father." "Richard, are there any prospects for legislation?" "No, Father." "Is there anything bright on the horizon, Richard?" "No, Father." And he would always end the conversation with something I've never heard in the city of London, Wall Street, or any other financial capital. He would end the conversation with, "I pray for you every night, Richard." Not exactly the typical Wall Street tone, given the state of the world. Anyway, Father Francis was well rewarded. We ended up with 400 companies, 17% of the Dow, IBM, DuPont, Intel, United Technologies, 11% or 11 of the top 100 Fortune 500 companies, Honeywell, Ford, International Paper, 25% of the U.S. power sector. Those companies in 9 years reduced emissions by 400 million tons, roughly the size of France. We motivated agriculture, and recently we sold the company. We came public at £1, sold it at £7.50, so Father Francis is a very happy man. And I'm a happy man because I wouldn't have wanted his client to be unhappy with the experiment. These lessons now are being tackled and will be confronted in this part of the world, first by China and then by India. And I'm very bullish about the future in Asia of market-based solutions to environmental challenges. I give a talk at Peking University, and 2-3 years ago, you go to America, I teach at Kellogg and the University of Chicago. I have graduate students, the best and the brightest. I start talking about markets. Contrasted 8,000 miles away, give a lecture at Peking University to undergraduates, some graduates. Dean says, "Don't use the Chinese slides. Everybody's bilingual." So I cut that out. I start talking about Coasian economics and gains from trade to Ricardo. Dean says, "Elevated, you're speaking too low." Students are getting bored. I finally go through the lecture, and I'm sensing some very, questions that are a little too smart. And finally, some young woman, 21 years old, soaking wet, raises her hand and says, "Why is there a contango between the December 12 European carbon and US carbon?" There's actually an undergraduate emissions trading club at Peking University. They're very aware of the philosophy. As a matter of fact, in almost, and I'll choose my words carefully, in almost the irony of all ironies, there's a better understanding of cap and trade in Beijing than there is in Washington, D.C. Okay, in a communist economy, the need to do it and the need to do markets is really very, very high. Finally, how do you begin a market? The answer is pretty straightforward. It's 12 steps. It's all we did, and we ran the biggest market in Europe. We ran a voluntary market. You define the commodity, allowances, the rights to emit, offsets from animal methane, for tree planting, preservation, etc. You establish market oversight. You define baselines, you set targets, you develop an allowance clearinghouse so there's firm counterparties. You employ existing exchanges when you can so you don't build it up. You develop trade documentation and so forth and so on. We monitored 400 companies, verified independently with FINRA, an agency that was created by an act of Congress, and for 400 companies with emissions 10% the size of China and a third of Europe for $1.5 million a year. That was our cost. So all the people who talk about it's technically impossible, you can't do it, is just simply unambiguously wrong. In conclusion, what have we said? We said markets evolve over time and value does. The challenge and the opportunity in the 21st century will be air and water. That's one. Two, markets historically go through 7 stages, whether it's the Dutch East India Company or wheat trading in Chicago in 1848. Those 7 stages have emerged in air and water. 3, you have a couple of policy alternatives. Those policy alternatives are command and control or markets. And then 4, we talked about the efficacy of markets in SO2 and how the cost-benefit ratio resulted in 123 billion of gains versus about $1 billion of costs. 5th, we said China is ripe. It has the air and water problems. And 7, we said it's pretty easy to tackle. I'm totally optimistic that we're going to be able to look at these problems in 20 years the same way we now look at acid rain. There's a bright future out there. It's an issue for the young. We turn out more students in China at various universities. Same thing in India. And I firmly believe that if we work together, there is a simple problem, and we can use market-based solutions to solve social and environmental problems. Thank you all very much.